Als nächstes spricht Julia Kloiber, die Gründerin des feministischen Thinktanks Superlab, live aber remote.
Now,
Mit dem Vater des World Wide Web und Google Chief
we
Internet Evangelist Vint
we
Cerf
have a
über die nächsten
famous feminist
Entwicklungsschritte des
talking with
Internets.
Vint Cerf
Vint, it's great to have
from
you here.
Google.
Thanks so much for being part of
Thank you.
Republica.
Ich freut mich sehr. Guten Tag.
Guten Tag, schön, dass du da bist.
By the way, very important point. I'm not the father of the World Wide Web. That is Tim Berners-Lee, the person who did the World Wide Web in 1991. Bob Kahn and I did the internet, and that was way back in the 1970s. So just to make sure everybody understands, the web sits on top of the world of the internet as an application.
Thanks so much for crediting everybody correctly and also for being a part of our little experiment today. We're going to be very curious to hear your thoughts about the next steps of developing this global technology that has changed all of our lives. And we noticed latest now in the last couple of weeks how incredibly is important as our running and operating system of society and how desperately we need to improve that infrastructure and make it available for all people across the globe. So over to you, Vint. Thanks very much for being with us and looking forward to your talk.
It's a real pleasure to join Republica this morning, or I guess this afternoon, your time. First of all, let me remind you that Winston Churchill said, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." And as I think about that, I'm thinking our challenge is do not allow the pandemic to become our Titanic. This is a huge global challenge, and there are many issues that we all have to deal with over a period of time as this global pandemic continues to unfold. I have personal experience with the virus. My wife and I were both contracted the virus while we were in London in early March. We got back to the Washington, D.C. area. I started showing symptoms of fever and headaches and chills and all the usual things. By good fortune, our symptoms were fairly mild. We had great difficulty getting tested. It was hard to find anybody who would test. We eventually had to pay $500 each to a clinic in Washington, D.C. to confirm that we had contracted this virus. I have to say the physical effects were a lot less alarming than the psychological ones, because you kept hearing about the progress of the disease and how it could suddenly take a really terrible turn. You would have trouble breathing, end up in the hospital, maybe even on a ventilator. And since you don't know how the course of this disease is going to unfold for you personally, it becomes extremely stressful, even if the physical symptoms are very mild. The last point is it took several weeks to recover energy back. So these are all significant things that many people experience, and I have now personal experience with it as well. And so I feel for everyone who is either exposed to this disease or worried about being exposed. Well, let me just start out by saying that Google is both humble and feeling very responsible for the role that it plays in the World Wide Web. It is a source of information for literally billions of people. And so we're very concerned about the quality of that information, both in our search engine and also in what we call information panels, where we try to pull information specific to a hot topic, in this case, the COVID-19 epidemic. So we're working very hard to make sure the information that we supply people is useful. The second thing I would observe is that not everyone speaks the same language, and not all the information that's out on the World Wide Web is in the same language. So we're making heavy use of machine learning and language translation in order to make information more accessible to everyone. And finally, we are all confronted with a very serious problem of misinformation and disinformation. Some of it is put out there out of ignorance, but some of it is put out there deliberately to confuse people or to otherwise mislead them. And figuring out how to detect that and how to alert people to its presence is not so easy. It's not a simple algorithm. It requires that the users of our services and other services use their brains to think about what they're seeing and hearing and to try to separate the good quality information from bad quality information. So we all have a responsibility to cope with that. And that's generally true for all of our services, search, YouTube, and other information products. The internet is playing a pretty extraordinary role in this entire event that we're going through right now. One of them is just providing access to information. It's supporting remote online work. It's supporting interactions like the one that we're in the middle of. I've actually been pretty amazed that it's been able to handle the kind of two-way interaction that we're currently engaged in. For some time, a lot of the internet was used to stream video, stream audio, get access to content coming towards the users. And that was asymmetric. So you didn't have to have as much bandwidth going into the internet as you had coming back out. Now, here we are. We're making use of both directions, and the internet has managed to hold up pretty well. And honestly, a bit to my surprise, but it means that the people who build the infrastructure have invested heavily in increasing capacity to deal with all that. We're also seeing that the internet could play a very important role in tracking and tracing. Many of you appreciate that discovering that you may have been exposed to the COVID virus is extremely important. And so finding a way to alert users to that possibility is very important. At the same time, we have to protect people's privacy. So what we don't want, for example, is for people to have tracking of locations and time and date and so on. And the system that Google and Apple are working on inhibits the use of any of that information in the APIs that we're developing. But we are trying to, and we're randomizing identifiers so that the trace of interactions is not using a fixed identifier. They're dynamically assigned. So we're protecting people's privacy while giving them the opportunity to opt in, both to report that they have become COVID-19 positive, so as to alert others who may have been in their vicinity. And of course, we're also trying to allow people to find out by opting in that they might have been exposed, so they can do something about that. There is a very clear indication as we look at the internet's role in all of this that it is still inadequately available, and it is also asymmetrically available. Not everyone has access, and those who do may not have adequate access in terms of capacity. This is true not only in rural parts of the world, but it's also true in urban parts of the world. And it may even be the case that if internet access is available, it may still not be affordable, or it might not be reliable. And so those of us who are involved in making the internet more useful are very concerned about making sure that it is safe to be online, that it's affordable, that it's reliable, that it's sustainable and available. So this is a huge challenge to get the other 4 billion people who are not yet on the internet onto the system, or at least making it available to them. When I was the president of the Internet Society, one of my favorite phrases was, "Internet is for everyone, but we have to actually work hard to make that true." One thing that I believe is extremely important is to help develop policies that will make the internet safer, more useful, affordable, and so on. And one way to do that is to adopt what are called multi-stakeholder processes in order to inform policymaking. This is something that the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, the Internet Society, the Internet Governance Forum, and many other bodies recognize as an important theme for the production of good quality policy to make the internet the useful tool that it can be and should be. The United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, organized a high-level panel on digital cooperation last year. I was honored to participate in that panel. The focus of attention was how to increase our ability to cooperate with each other on a global scale with regard to the digital technologies that we are becoming so much more dependent upon. Out of that high-level panel was a report that was delivered in June of 2019, and it observed that we exist now in an age of interdependence. And I think that the COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated how interdependent we are. When you think about the supply chains for food, for equipment, for all kinds of things that we depend on, when they break down, because the people who are doing manufacturing or who are growing food or doing other things that we depend on can't do their jobs because of the COVID virus or because of the policy-driven shutdowns in order to prevent the virus from propagating, interferes with those supply chains. So we are more interdependent now in almost every dimension than we ever have been before. And it's really important for us to both recognize that and to learn how to build more resilience into those supply chains, to build in local capacities to recover in the face of inadequate access to materials, foods, and other things. We also have to worry a lot about protecting our citizens from harm online. And I'm sorry to say that the internet is a platform that allows some people to harm others. And that's something I wish that we could have avoided, but it's the nature of generalized platforms. So people send malware around, they bully people, they send misinformation and disinformation and other kinds of things that cause confusion. And those things need to be dealt with, and policies are needed in order to deal with that. Some technology is needed, but as I say, wetware up here may be one of the most important tools for combating some of those problems. So there are all kinds of things that we should be doing as we confront the virus epidemic, and we ask what role does the internet have in helping with that. There are a number of organizations, and I'll just mention a few that are focused on that. One is called Internet and Jurisdiction. It's a policy network led by Bertrand de la Chapelle out of Paris, which is coming to grips with the policy questions that arise in this internet context. Another one is the Internet Governance Forum, which has been meeting every year since 2006. And that group is very multi-stakeholder. It's been looking at issues arising, problems arising, possible policy responses to it. And as we go forward into the rest of this new decade, the IGF is evolving into something which may actually be able to make recommendations to deal with some of the problems that we now understand are part of the internet environment and the application space that sits on top of it. In a sense, internet governance is a shared responsibility. Not only do we as citizens and users of the internet have a responsibility to use it in thoughtful ways, but those of us who are part of companies that offer the internet service or offer applications on top of it, provide information access and the like, all have a very serious responsibility to help organize and instantiate good quality governance practices. Another thing which is quite vital to the internet's continued utility is the evolution of standards for the internet. The Internet Engineering Task Force, the World Wide Web Consortium, the IEEE, the International Telecommunications Union, the International Standards Organization, all of those organizations have roles to play in creating standards that allow for interoperability on the internet. And in one of the previous segments, there was some discussion about the Internet of Things. This is billions of devices that can connect to the internet, can interact with each other through it. That only works if those billions of devices observe standards that permit this interoperability. And one of the most important elements of internet has been its ability to permit interoperation among devices that never met each other before. So there are some lessons that I think we should learn from this pandemic. One of them is that we need to prepare better for situations like this. One example is to have national stockpiles with strategic equipment and other requirements available and properly outfitted in order to deal with surge requirements that might not otherwise arise. We did not do a good job of that here in the United States. We also need to understand who has what role in response to various kinds of crises, and those roles will vary. In the case of the pandemic, for example, the medical community is a key element of the emergency management organizations are key elements. We need to decide ahead of time exactly who should have what responsibility so that we don't have to make those decisions in the middle of a crisis when, in fact, we don't have time to think about that. So let's do that ahead of time. We need to facilitate international cooperation, especially for a crisis which is global in scope, as this one is. And oh, by the way, so is global warming. That's another global crisis, and it's one that's going to require a lot of global cooperation. We should be thinking about that ahead of time in order to know what to do and when to do it in order to respond in a timely and effective way. I'm thinking a little bit about other possible activities that we might engage in. Those of us who are worried about safety and security on the internet uh, believe that, of course, there are national organizations that deal with national security. But what about the security on the net for people like you and me? We don't necessarily have all the expertise we need in order to deal with malware and the distribution of attacks against our network facilities. Maybe we need a cyber fire department, kind of like the one you call when the house is on fire, except in this case, it's your laptop or your router that's on fire, and you need help. Um, there are some experiments along those lines that are going on to help people deal with problems like that on the internet. Another thing which is extremely important is to introduce on a global scale the concept of cyber stability, in particular, the idea of protecting the core of the internet from attack in the same way that we have agreements not to do certain things like bombing schools and hospitals, even in time of war. We could globally agree that we will not attack any of the core infrastructure of the network, the routers, the optical fiber networks, the domain name system, the other elements that make the internet work. If we are going to rely on it increasingly, as we have been, then we should try to protect that as a matter of policy. I think all of us who are now in the midst of this particular crisis are discovering that the internet is allowing us to find new ways to work. Many of us are working from home if we're fortunate enough to have jobs that allow that. My office is wherever my laptop happens to be and wherever the internet is accessible. Not everyone benefits from that, but certainly many will and are. And so we can imagine new kinds of applications on the internet changing the way we work. Here's an example. I noticed that I was having trouble getting appointments at a doctor's office that they didn't want me to come in because I had tested positive for COVID-19. And so they insisted on doing remote consultations. And it occurred to me that that meant they couldn't get physical information about heart rate, blood pressure, and so on. And so remote sensing may turn out to be a very critical part of the new kind of medical care where we wear sensors and capture information that doctors need in order to diagnose problems. But we could do that remotely if we have the right IoT sensor devices that would permit us to give that information to the doctor remotely. So that's just one kind of example. Another thing, of course, drones are showing up everywhere, and there's a lot of thought to curbside delivery or front door delivery. And in this current crisis, that might become extremely attractive, even if it sounded very speculative in science fiction, like even 6 months ago. Another possibility would be better tools for finding information on the network, helping people amass large quantities of it, sift through it, find the meat that's important. That'll be important for research as well, helping better tools for that. So there's a huge takeaway here that I think we should keep in mind. The world is more connected now than it ever has been. And I think that it induces a great need for more cooperation all around the world. Because of this connectivity and because of this interdependence, when things go wrong somewhere, it has impacts elsewhere in the world. So now is not the time for isolation. It is a time for cooperation. It's a time for working together in order to solve really significant problems. Now, I do admit that social distancing is turning out to be important in this particular crisis because we don't want to infect each other. But we still need to be able to work together, even if we can't do it face to face. So this is all about solidarity, and that word has come up more than once in the discussions that we've had, that you've had during the course of these broadcasts. So that's a very important thing. The other thing, which I think is very critical, is to understand the degree to which inequality is being highlighted in the course of this pandemic. People who don't have adequate resources are less able to respond or to survive through a period of time when they can't work, for example. And that's why we need safety nets. That's why we need, in the US anyway, there's legislation to extend benefits to people who can't work. We have literally tens of millions of people who are out of jobs right now because of the shutdown that's trying to protect them and
May
to
I chime
prevent
in
this.
here?
Yes, of
Thank
course.
you
Go
so much,
ahead.
Vint. Thank you for this food for thought. I have maybe two more questions about what you've just been telling us, the different examples that you gave us. And we'll later have time for the audience also to ask some questions. I was wondering, because you
Okay.
said, are we letting this crisis go? We shouldn't let this crisis go to waste. So do you think we're on the right path? What's your prediction for post-corona times? Here in Germany, politicians are discussing, for example, subsidizing car purchases right now. So I'm not sure we're on the right track. So I was wondering, like, where do you see opportunities for change in your field, and are we on track there?
I think so. I think that it's becoming very clear that there are new opportunities for different kinds of work, as well as different ways of doing things that we have been doing. I think it also informs people who are supporting the infrastructure of the internet and the World Wide Web to focus even more on making that solid, stable, safe, and useful, and having adequate capacity to do what it needs to do. So my sense is that it's pretty hard to ignore the fact that we have opportunities here to not only respond to this existing crisis, but to look towards the future in anticipation of need. And so, in a sense, this crisis is like a spotlight on the future for us.
Yeah. And still, when we talk about the crisis, we a lot of times innovation, like what are new things that we could develop. And when you say digital infrastructure, then there's also a huge part is maintenance of the infrastructure, right? Like developing it further, maintaining it. And that's, as far as I see, not as much in the spotlight. So what do you think? What can we do to highlight the importance of maintenance in that area and make that more attractive for people and politicians to focus on?
So, actually, a very good question. One answer to that is let's measure how well the internet is working. Let's get real data about how well people are served by the internet. And it's not only the access to the internet to an ISP, for example, but what about your own equipment at home? What about the possibility of needing to replace the equipment because it's not serving you as well as it should? We need to help people see that so that they know to say, I need work, I need more maintenance, I need to upgrade the equipment. So that is an opportunity as well.
Mm-hmm. And because you mentioned multi-stakeholder processes, and I'm working with a lot of civil society organizations, and of course they are always mentioned as part of these processes next to companies, states, academia. But especially here in Germany, I sometimes get the feeling that it's a nice add-on to have the civil society in the room and to hear their opinion, but they're not taken, as like serious stakeholders as folks who advance the discussion there. So I'm wondering, like, in these processes, how well is civil society, how well are civil society organizations represented, and do they have a say? And if not, like, how can we change that?
It's well, first of all, I think civil society does not always get the hearing that it should. It's very difficult to represent civil society. There, individuals will say, "I represent civil society," and you kind of wonder, well, who is feeding you with the information and knowledge you need in order to be representative? And there's some struggle about that. One thing I will say, this is drawing on what we experience at Google. Data is very, very valuable for making arguments. So the more data that we can get, hard data that is validatable, to help us underscore the needs that civil society identifies, could be very powerful. Where is the internet? Where is it available? What other problems are there? Do we have real, solid, verifiable data about those problems so that it's irrefutable that we need to do something.
Mm. Yeah, because a lot of times, I mean, when we talk about civil society, there's also a lack of resources, right? Like there's huge power imbalances. Do you think in these multi-stakeholder processes that others have to take a step back or take some power, let go of some power, and states or companies doing that in favor of like more actors, more diversity to participate in these processes?
Well, I would say that the online environment offers an almost asymmetric opportunity to regain a certain amount of visibility. I mean, we've seen social media and how powerful they can be. And so it's possible that civil society needs to make even more use of those media in order to be heard and to be appreciated. It is really quite surprising to see how voices that might not have ever surfaced are much, much more visible in the online world. Now, at the same time, we also know that the social media can be abused in various and sundry ways. So how do we balance protection against the abusive use while at the same time allowing it to amplify voices who need to be heard in order to solve serious problems?
That's a good note to. In order to amplify voices to be heard, we're going to move actually to the Q&A session where our audience gets to ask you some questions in 10 minutes at 4:35, and we have some time now to transition to Zoom, or people can stay in YouTube, but yeah, we'll all reconvene there. So thank you very much for the keynote and for the first answers, and very much looking forward to the Q&A now. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. So am I. See you in a bit.